Computer. Hi, everybody, and I'd like to thank every one of our Facebook friends for joining us on our community education series today. We are talking about elder abuse and what it is, when should you call, and who do you call? So we're excited to talk about this topic because it does appear, unfortunately, to be happening more often than not. And we want to help you understand what that looks like and where you should go. I am Misty Delgado. I am the founder and owner of Relivar Home Care and Alivity Care Advocates. If you know somebody who is struggling with what to do with their loved one, may need a caregiver, thinks that they can remain in their home, but they're not sure, they may need some guidance on what to do and may need some help on a direction to go into. That is where Relivar and Alivity can come in and assist. We can help guide them. You can have them give us a call. Krista is the person who's on with me today. She's our administrator, and she handles probably most of those calls, right, Krista?
Yeah, that's right. And so if you are, worried about those things or unsure about the future, give me a call and we can talk through it.
Yeah, so good to see you, Krista. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And I would like to introduce the knowledgeable person today on understanding elder abuse, and that is Melissa Maha. Did I get it
Excellent.
close? Okay.
Very excellent. Good work.
Okay. Okay.
Good work.
So Melissa is with the Disability Network of Michigan, and they do just a ton of wonderful things for our community. So Melissa, thank you for joining us today. And if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you ended up doing what you're doing, how you got your knowledge, and about Disability Network, because I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are not familiar with your company.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Misty and Krista, for having me. I really appreciate it. Anytime I get the opportunity to talk about this topic, I absolutely take it. The more we spread the knowledge, the better we are as a community at spotting and doing something about elder abuse or older adult abuse. So my name is Melissa Mahach. I actually fell into aging sideways, as they say. I have a master's in clinical psychology, and when I was working on my thesis, I was much more interested in coping and finding benefits for caregivers of people with Alzheimer's. After recruiting a ton of participants from Alzheimer's Association support groups, going to them, listening to the kinds of things that caregivers not only struggled with, but also had solutions for, really creative solutions for. Um, I, I I felt that that was definitely the place where I needed to go. So nobody was talking about it, and yet it seemed to be such a challenging, rewarding, and untalked about part of aging. And so I was all in at that point. I then went and worked on a PhD in clinical psychology. I actually ended up leaving my PhD um, for reasons we can talk about way beyond this is a whole nother podcast. But uh, basically, uh, while I enjoyed and got some excellent training in terms of geropsychiatry, elder law consultations for determining capacity, working in the state that I was in, their only geropsychology state hospital at the time. So everybody was 60 and older, everybody was court committed, and really the legal issues as we age that come up sometimes. So that all happened. And then, then my grandmother actually experienced financial abuse by somebody posing as a bank employee.
Oh,
Um,
sorry.
and so then that happened. So then I started working for Disability Network, Eastern Michigan. At the time, it was Disability Network, Oakland and Macomb. We've since grown and added 5 counties of the thumb. Um, and I got hired in as the nursing facility transition outreach specialist. So helping people from a nursing home go to the community. So a lot of times I would be doing things like calling agencies like Relevar, see if that would be possible to arrange care, because they would need a little bit of care, but not enough to warrant a nursing facility. So kind of that sweet spot where you need a little support, but aren't quite ready to do that assistive living kind of situation. So that's still one of the things that we do as an agency. And that's still part of our transition services that we provide. We also do transition services for younger adults, so those who have developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities who are aging out of the school system into young adults. Helping ease that transition not only for the young adults, but also their families as well. We do a ton of advocacy around uh, what it's like to live as a person with a disability. Um, we do a ton of resource provision for people. So anyone can call. You have a question about anything disability related, whether it's you, a friend, a loved one, a spouse, doesn't really matter. And I also, as part of my work at DNEM, I facilitate six, I think we're up to six now, peer support groups. So those are for anybody, any ages, and there's certain areas that we touch. Um, we're starting a veterans one, which I'm really excited as part of our SSVF program, or kind of in conjunction with that. And then we have our RISE peer support group, which is really for those who have a disability and also identify as LGBTQ plus or lesbian, gay, bisexual, and or transgender, plus the rest of the spectrum. So I think that kind of wraps up everything. Did I miss anything?
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's safe to say I came to this work not only from a professional sort of perspective, but also that personal kind of connection to the material.
Yeah.
So we are actually, one thing I didn't, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I realized there's two things that I forgot to mention. One is that pretty soon after I started working at DNEM, which was almost 7 years ago now, we were awarded a grant to do the prevention of elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation grant. And it's a 3-year grant. We are now in the third cycle. So we've been continuously funded for this work since then. And I am the person who goes out and talks to everybody about this uncomfortable, challenging material.
So you are knowledgeable.
I try to be.
Okay.
I try to have a good base to come from.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so my agency also serves anybody with any kind of disability, all ages, which is another important thing about us. And because of our regulations and funding, at least 50% of our employees have a disability themselves, at least one disability themselves. I am pretty open. I am one of those 50 something percent that has a disability. For me, mine's mental health. That helps to illustrate how wide a variety of disability we're talking, not just physical, but also mental health, developmental, everything.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that. That's amazing. Krista, did you have something you wanted to touch on?
I was just gonna say it's good that you not only have that professional piece, but you have that personal piece and you've dealt with it personally, because that brings other things to the table, when you have that compassion and you've been through something like that, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I absolutely. It's interesting. Sometimes I think we think that experience that we have is shameful or not something we want to share with people, but the truth is that it influences us in the way that we respond to other people in so many ways that we don't think about it.
Yeah. So let's get into it then. Let's talk about elder abuse. What is elder abuse?
Yeah. So you'll find some, great question. You'll find some disagreement in lots of different places. Some people, and what I mean by that is some people think or posit that um, financial exploitation is something different than financial abuse, or that neglect isn't necessarily a form of abuse as we typically understand it. It's something bad that happens, but not quite abuse, or that bullying, which happens a lot. I see a lot happening in various communal living situations largely. Um, but a lot of times we don't think of that as abuse. Today, when I talk about abuse, I'm going to talk about it really focusing in on 5 different categories. So, really, physical abuse, emotional or psychological abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, and then neglect. And those are the ones that I find in the literature there's the most agreement on. Um, so one of the important things I wanted to start by saying is that um, it's usually not the case that somebody experiences just symptoms of one type of abuse when they're in an abusive situation. A lot of times they experience symptoms that fall under multiple categories. At the end of the day, it does not matter if your loved one is experiencing physical abuse or sexual abuse. Abuse is abuse, and it's all a crime. It's all prosecutable in the state of Michigan. It's all prosecutable in federal courts. Um, so at the end of the day, it matters less what particular type and more that it is in fact happening, and from a loved one's perspective. Now, other perspectives might disagree with that, but from a loved one's perspective, that is it.
Okay. So that's good to know. So we've got physical, we've got emotional, we've got sexual, we've got financial, and then we have neglect.
Hmm.
So if you could take us, maybe walk us through each one of those, because I know the families that we've worked with in the last 21 years or so, they're
Yeah.
always concerned, like, when do you know when it's gone from just being a little problematic to now something that I need to call on or I need to reach out for help?
Yeah, that's a great that's often such a dilemma for loved ones. Um, I can tell you, in my particular family, with my grandmother, my aunt, who's a CPA, helped her do her finances, and regularly like reconcile her bank account and things like that. It took 6 months from the time that the abuse actually happened to the time that my grandmother mentioned something to my aunt or my aunt discovered something was amiss. Um, and at that time, it was my aunt asking, "Hey, what's going on?" Um, that really allowed my grandmother to open up. Um, and so, and part of me thinks a lot of that was due to uh, a shame or just not knowing how to say something weird happened. Um, but it was the asking that really helped my grandmother open up because initially she just talked about how she was worried her lights were going to get cut off, um, which doesn't seem at all related once you know the whole story. So sometimes the things that you hear as a family member that don't always make sense, sometimes that can be a tip off that, like, hey, there's more to the story, and just getting to the bottom of it. Maybe it's abuse, maybe it's just an oversight or one blip, right? Um, so to back up a little and talk about the different types of abuse, and give a little bit more information about that. So physical abuse is, I think, what most people tend to think of when they think of abuse. So it's like the hitting, the kicking, the pushing, the shoving. It's it's the moving, it's the shoving out of the way, even when somebody is in a wheelchair. Like, it's the things like that. It's the unexplained bruises, fractures, bleeding, things like that. Um, and then when we talk about emotional or psychological abuse,
Melissa,
that's
can I just stop you before we go on to that next
please,
area?
yes,
Only
of
because,
course, hop in.
first of all, I want to thank you for talking about the lights cut off, because it's always, when we're typically even dealing with our clients or families, it's usually something very soft like that, that you have to, it's like a butterfly flying in the air. And if you don't catch it, you're never going to follow the trail, you know? It could, like you said, be a trail that, you know, leads to nowhere, but unless you follow that trail, you'll never know. But so many times it's something so soft and so gentle like that, that you have to start at, then what you said is asking questions, following up, checking on things to see if there isn't something else, and not just minimizing the situation like, oh, you know, there she goes again, worried about the bills. She's always worried about something, you know. And I find so many times children of parents, they just want to shove that stuff under the bed and not worry about it. But that's usually where we need to give them the opportunity to talk about the situation.
Absolutely. And it's one to let the older adult talk about it. But two, a lot of times, um, setting up that exchange well ahead of time to be very non-judgmental, to be very accepting of the truth, or just accepting that what the person is telling you is the truth.
Is their
Um,
truth. Yes.
I often come across, I often see, particularly when we start talking about cognitive impairment or dementia, people's accounts of unbecoming behavior, and I use air quotes around that very generously, um,
Mhm.
but that questionable behavior, sometimes people chalk up to, oh, that's just the dementia talking, or they don't really remember,
Right.
or how would they know? They don't even know what day it is. Um, that kind of approach is unlikely to um, light up any abuse that might be happening.
Mhm.
Um, in fact, it's old now, but there's definitely research out there that talks about how older adults, or people with dementia, even when they're in late stages of dementia, will still appropriately react to people behaviorally. They'll still react to people who have threatened them, people who are nice to them, people who are mean to them. You'll see those like avoidance kinds of behaviors even when people are late stages. So
Right.
people know.
Yeah.
Um, so I always encourage people, that's part of like listening with an open mind, right? Like, it may not be anything. It may really be the dementia talking, but it may not be.
Right. Right. So it's interesting because we talk about the physical component of this, and to, you know, to just tie this back a little bit to what we were saying, we've had a client in a community that had, you know, bruises on her,
Mm,
and she was late stage dementia. Remember, Krista? But she could still tell us that she was hurt by a caregiver, you know,
mm-hmm,
and actually who did it. Mhm.
mm-hmm.
And so we, of course, listened to her. But one of the things I think we've learned over time is to be quiet. Ask a question and be quiet. So that,
Oh my gosh,
you know,
that's
it's uncomfortable.
revolutionary,
Yes,
honestly.
yes,
Like,
yes,
it's revolutionary to be quiet and truly listen.
yes. Yeah.
You didn't know
Well,
you were revolutionary, did you?
well, we tell her that all the time, so.
Yeah, no, 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 no.
Um, we also noticed that when you mentioned that's the dementia talking or those kind of things. That's all not always just family members that are like trying to sweep it under the rug, but a lot of time the abusers um bring that to the family or somebody else who's questioning what is occurring, and they try and make that the excuse, like, oh, she lost her mind, or you know
Yeah.
what I mean. So we have to like be really careful with that too, because oftentimes it's an abuser doing that.
Yeah, it's tricky. I think it's tricky to know when essentially you're being gaslighted by by an abuser and when it's
Mhm.
truly like happening, right? Like sometimes
Yeah.
it's very hard, especially as a family member, when you're not like living with your loved one and you visit, regularly, but maybe not every day for hours at a time or different times of the day or things like that. Um, Sometimes it's hard to know what's the truth, right? And that's when it's really helpful to start, um, I think, reaching out to other family members who might also have a relationship with that loved one. Hey, have you noticed? Have they said anything? What
Mhm.
do you think of that? What do you make of that? And even asking the person themselves, right? Like, I know you mentioned this like multiple times. Like, can you tell me more? Or do you want to talk about it? Or um, do you need some space? Know that I'm here when you're ready to do something about it, right? Because for anybody who's worked with, say, a survivor of domestic violence, um, now is not always the time where they're ready to do something, to take an action, right? Because in abusive situations, a lot of time the survivor has had all of their decision making taken away from them. They've been controlled to a certain point that they don't have autonomy to be able to say, oh, I'm going to do this. And so by restoring that autonomy as a third party, by giving them the choice whether or not to disclose, which steps to take, and what ways to take those steps, what they're comfortable with, um, that starts to restore that balance of power a little bit. And sometimes that helps people start to feel like they can actually take a very physical action to get themselves out of that.
Mhm.
And I think if, when you look at domestic abuse versus, like a senior or somebody with a disability, that might look different, especially for us, because we're more mandated to report. Family members are not. But in our instances, we have to report the situation. So it doesn't give them much control. But when it comes to the physical abuse piece, I know you said we're talking about bruises, black eyes, fractures, lacerations, grip marks. And this was just recently with one of our clients in a community, actually had hand marks on both of her arms from having a caregiver lift her. Now, family members wouldn't have seen that because she's always wearing long sleeves in a community. So it's important to give those family members the chance to, like, oh, let's change your shirt, or let's fix your bra, or whatever we need to do to kind of do a body check,
Yeah.
without making it quite apparent. But physical abuse, would you say that's one of the more popular ones, the physical and
Mm-hmm.
or financial?
Yeah. So, so I want to back up just a little bit. I will get to that. But I want to back up just a little bit, and say that what I have learned by doing this work, for the time that I have, is that I find domestic violence or intimate partner violence really happens throughout people's life. I've seen intimate partner violence, domestic violence happen as people age. I've seen it start off at the very beginning of their relationship, quiet down, and then as they've lived their life together, it sparks back up as they get older. And especially when we start talking about developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities, that is a risk factor, for experiencing domestic violence and abuse in general, but really domestic violence. So I just wanted to make sure and throw that out there. because those things certainly do exist as people age. So you might come across that as well.
Absolutely. Yes.
Backing up to so the most reported type of abuse is actually financial abuse.
Okay.
Um,
Well, let's move on to that then.
yeah, I know, right? So financial abuse is really anytime a person's money is taken from them without their consent, really. When they are coerced into giving their money, when they are tricked into giving their money, such as my grandmother. In fact, that was a lot of coercion because the scam artist used the threat that her banking account was going to be overdrawn, and that's what prompted her to transfer the money. So basically, he scared the bejesus out of her. And then she decided to transfer the money, right? So even though she willingly did it, she did it under duress,
Yeah.
right? Nobody's going to walk up to you on the street with a bag of money saying, "Here, have this money," right? Same thing with scams that people often get, like sweetheart scams, grandchild scams, romantic scams, all kinds. There's all kinds out there. Um, in fact, the successful aging. Oh my gosh, why can I not remember the acronym? The SAFE program out of Wayne State University, their Institute of Gerontology with Dr. Lichtenberg and Latoya Hall. They talk a lot about scams that go on in our areas. They're a great resource to reach out to if you find yourself in that situation. But anything, it can be investment scams, it can be straight up harassing somebody to walk into the bank and withdraw money to give it to you. It can be the postal scams that you get, the email scams, all kinds of things. All that falls under financial abuse. It's basically theft.
Yes.
Um, so that is the most reported type of abuse. The least reported type of abuse, can y'all guess? Do, 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 do.
Sex.
Yes.
Because
How did you know?
it's uncomfortable to talk about that, right?
Oh, for sure. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, of course. Although, when I do my presentation in real life, I always ask, does anybody have like an expiration date on your sex life? Like nobody raises their hand, right? But yet we don't want to think that older adults could still be raped, could still be. I hope there's like an explicit warning on this. We're adults, we're talking about adult things here.
Yes, yes.
Um, so if you don't want to talk about adult things,
Don't
pause just
listen.
a second. Pause just a second, and then you can come back in like 5 minutes. Uh, so things like rape, things like sodomy, things like explicit photographs without the person's consent, things like unwanted touching, um, even remarks, right? Sexual or lewd remarks, like all of those count as sexual abuse. People don't report, no matter how old you are, especially not as we age. We don't. We don't report it, right? It doesn't mean it's not happening. It doesn't mean it's not happening at the same frequency that other types of abuse are happening. We don't know because it doesn't get reported nearly as frequently. Um, so some of the things, again, that some of the things that you can look for that sometimes indicate that sexual abuse is happening. Um, Again, a lot of times that the bruises, but in like on like torso areas, or unexplained bleeding from private areas, a lot of times are those indicators that something's going on. Something. I do want to make the disclaimer that there are very genuine medical reasons why some of these things happen. People bruise easily when they take Coumadin, right? Like it's a well-known side effect. However, if you're starting to get some fearful behavior, some avoidant behavior, some withdrawal, anxiety, if somebody's looking depressed all of a sudden, things like that, in conjunction with these signs, that's when I would start thinking about, okay, something's going on. We need to find out what exactly is happening.
Mhm. Right. Well, we appreciate that because we don't hear about that as often, in our industry. Krista, I've never heard of it, haven't come across it at this point. So you're right.
You're very fortunate.
Yeah,
I hope that continues to be the case.
me too.
I really do.
So let's go on to emotional. What is emotional abuse?
So emotional abuse is really what sometimes people think of as psychological abuse. It's those insults, the demeaning kind of comments. It's the, you can't eat that. You're too fat to eat that. You shouldn't be eating that. Nobody's going to want you. Things like that. Nobody else, who are you going to get to care for you if I don't? Those kinds of things. It's also cutting off people from other relationships. Again, that sort of like controlling, manipulative kind of behavior.
Mhm.
Um, Sometimes it's also, and here's where it kind of, that gray area where sometimes what people are experiencing doesn't nicely map onto certain categories of symptoms. I can't tell you how many people I've come across, especially in domestic violence situations or intimate partner violence situations, where the survivor doesn't have access. If they are able to work, they don't have access to the money that they are earning from that because that is commandeered by the abuser. So even though they may be working, they may not actually have any financial resources to be able to leave or find a new place to live or um, pay for groceries or whatever it is. A lot of it is that manipulative, controlling, isolating kind of behavior.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's pretty wicked. Gaslighting falls underneath that. So that idea, like somebody trying to convince you that what you see, heard, thought, or felt didn't actually happen. That's what gaslighting is for those who aren't aware. So it can really take a lot of different forms. And I often find it in conjunction with other types of abuse as well.
Okay. Yeah, I hear you. I think that we've had some of those situations, Krista, more emotional when you talk
Yeah.
about examples of it.
Yeah.
We had an individual situation where a son living with parents,
Mm-hmm.
not working, put a gun on the table and told the dad, go ahead
Yeah.
and shoot yourself.
Yep.
So I think that would fall into that category. I mean, that's an extreme situation.
Uh,
No?
I've had I've known of folks who have had caregivers, whether they're professional or informal, doesn't really matter. They've had caregivers, they've been dependent on a caregiver to get their basic needs met, who have been told, you're going to stay in this room. You're not coming out of this room until I say so. And I don't know when I'm going to be back. And if you try to escape, I will kill you. Right? Didn't lay a hand on the person, didn't mess with their money,
Mhm.
didn't sexually abuse them. That's it. Right?
Right, right.
That's a crime.
I'm glad you bring these, I like to bring examples up because I think so many times it reminds me of people are like, oh, that's not really what they meant, or,
That's just how they are.
did that really happen? So we go back to that piece of minimizing the situation. These things really happen.
Yes.
Well, then if you think about it, it's all kind of, I mean, if we really stop and think about it, it's all kind of a form of victim blaming. Like, you don't know what you're actually talking. You're not a reliable reporter. That
Right,
you must have misinterpreted what I meant,
right, right,
right? Like, and that's all forms of victim blaming. We find it in all different kinds of abuse,
right,
whether or not the person is older, younger, has a disability. We find that as a common tactic.
right. So what about neglect? I find sometimes neglect it happens regularly, but
Yes.
um, it's sometimes families don't know if it really fits into the form of abuse.
Yeah. Um, I Personally, I like working with families where neglect is the issue. Um, I like it because for me, um, neglect means that they have not met the responsibilities of that caregiving relationship as the two parties negotiated. Essentially, that's a neglect, right? I agree with my grandmother that I'm going to go to the store every 3 weeks and get like toiletries, like toilet paper and shampoo and soap, stuff like that, right? And I have a sick kid that third week. Um, and I don't make arrangements for somebody else to go to the store and get those things and drop them off. And then it becomes 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, however long it is, right? Like to me, I like these types of cases because there are so many intervention points and so many possible ways to address it so that it's no longer neglectful.
Mhm.
Um, but I think people often I think it's very easy when you're in that caregiving situation, particularly if you're one of those caregivers who also finds themselves having their own family, having their own financial responsibilities. Maybe there's some distance involved, getting to and from the person, any number of reasons. Um, I think it becomes very difficult to see outside, see the possibilities of how the situation could get remedied,
Mhm.
if that makes any sense.
Yeah, can you like actually list out for us
Oh,
what kinds of things would fall into neglect?
right. So, and of course, this is all predicated on the fact that you've had this conversation with your loved one or the person that you're caring for. But things like uh, not coming over regularly to check on the person. If the person's diabetic, not making sure they have their insulin or any other life supporting medications. Not renewing those, forgetting to set them up for mail delivery or picking them up from the mailbox to actually take them in, right? Because those are two different things. Um, it's things like if you're the person who's supposed to be doing grocery shopping for the person and you just don't get to it, and the person runs out of food or water or any number of things that they might need. Um, not taking the person to appointments, medical appointments that they might have, just not taking it, not making arrangements for another way for them to get there. Those kinds of things are all, I would say, probably common types of neglect that I come across in my small neck of the woods. Y'all might have some more instances that y'all have come across as well.
Well,
But really,
one I can recall where the son did not want to give them blood pressure medicine because he didn't think they needed it.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Or we had another instance where a daughter was responsible for bringing food. Mom wasn't really eating much. And then the daughter said, well, you know what? If she doesn't eat, then, I guess she'll just die from malnutrition. So
yes.
it's kind of like a little bit of apathy instead of, really taking action to be sure that the individual is safe. Well, she had dementia. She didn't have the ability to remember whether she ate or she didn't eat,
Yeah,
so, and the
yeah.
amounts that she was eating was so small that she was just losing so much weight. I don't know, Krista, if you have any other instances that we've had.
Yeah, a caregiver or family member not changing a brief, somebody
Mm-hmm.
unable to get
Yes.
and bathroom on their own accord, somebody sitting in a brief for a long period of time, or basically being told that, you're staying here in bed, so I'll be here when I'm here, this is
Yes.
where you are. So, and being neglected in that way too.
Mhm. And I've had also it show up in terms of like withholding vaccinations as well. Um, because, the person's not going anywhere. They're not doing it. Like, you don't need, you know, whatever the older adult uh, wants or needs. So I've had it that way for various reasons, which again could be a whole different podcast.
Absolutely, yeah. So, all right, now we understand we've got physical, we've got emotional, we've got sexual, we've got financial, and we've got neglect. These are the ones, these are the buckets that we're talking about. If I have,
Yes.
let's say I just have a general concern, something's come to light, what do I do? I'm a
Yeah.
family member, I'm a friend of the family, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. So my first inclination, and I will, gleefully admit that this is partially because of the philosophy of the agency I work with, but I also happen to personally agree with it as well. Um, my first inclination is to always talk about, with the older adult, the survivor of abuse in question. Be like, what's your understanding of what's going on? I'm seeing some things that make me worried. Are you worried about it? And just kind of checking in with them to see. Sometimes that's not always realistic. Let's be real. This is sort of my ideal situation. This is how it would go. um, but sometimes that's just not realistic. Maybe the person is nonverbal, or maybe maybe the person you suspect is always around and is never far away.
Right,
That happens as well.
right.
Um, but I always try to find out their sort of thoughts about it first, and see if they have some ideas about where they want me to go next, right? Now, again, the picture looks a whole lot different if you're just a family member or neighbor or somebody like that. If you're a mandated reporter, obviously there's a different path that you have to go. And even in that mandated reporter path, um, I still try to consult with the older adult, the survivor in question, and say, look, I'm seeing some things that I have to report. Um, and I'm going to call, and this is what I'm going to say. And they may reach out to you, and this is what happens after I hang up with them, and kind of run through the process. Maybe they're like old hats at it, hopefully not. But maybe they're brand new, right? And sometimes alleviating some of that anxiety about reporting can be uh, lessened by just kind of walking through general steps.
Mhm.
Um, so sometimes I find that's even helpful in the mandated reporting track. But for a general loved one or neighbor, always, talk with the person. And then if there are other people, again, in the family or who come by, maybe they see the same things. Maybe they're equally as concerned. Maybe they're not. Maybe they know something you don't know, right? That's always possible. It's also possible to reach out to if there are any care agencies involved, if you notice there's any nurses or social workers or anybody who regularly visits. Even, sometimes people will have home delivery of like their like medications and stuff. Sometimes that person as well, you can just be like, hey, I noticed this and this and this happened. Have you seen anything or do you know anything? Right? They may say something, they may not, depending on what their role is. Who knows, right? The more we kind of talk to each other about it, the better off the survivor at the center of it will be, because um, I have found that abusers tend to use kind of a divide and conquer method
Sure.
of, oh, no, 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 no. And only telling one person this and telling somebody else something different, right? So that now there's conflict between them and now they don't know who to trust, right?
Right,
But it's all sown by that abuser,
right.
right? So the more you can kind of find that out without tipping off the abuser, the better. Because also we want to make our moves in silence as much as we can. So as not to tip off the abuser, because in some cases, it can exacerbate what's going on.
Right.
So again, use your best judgment. Being closer to the situation, you know more about the nuances of it. These are broad guidelines, broad guidelines. Um, Part of what I get funded to do and part of what I really like to do is talk to people who suspect that there might be abuse happening, and kind of work with them on a one-to-one kind of basis. So people are always welcome to give me a call. Um, I feel like there are other things that I may not have remembered to say, but
That's okay. I think that, what we're trying to help families realize is if you think something's happening, to not minimize it or, blame it back on the individual or think that they have dementia and they won't know. You would be surprised that to take some form of action, whether it's to call you and talk to you about the situation or adult protective services. I know a lot of people well, it's APS is the acronym we use in our industry, but adult protective services is typically where we call. And when we've had to have a conversation with the individual, they get very scared. They're like, oh, I'm going to be ripped from my home, or, I'm going to go to
yes,
jail, or whatever might
yes,
happen. I don't know. You have that experience as well, then,
yes, yes. Or what if nothing happens?
or nothing happens. Yeah.
Which is also scary.
Yes.
If you're dependent on somebody to provide, say, personal care, yeah, that's terrifying.
Right.
Super terrifying. Um, and so sometimes I always tell people, uh, APS is a great tool. Um, uh, it is one tool of many that you can use depending on the situation. Now, the one caveat I will say, obviously, is if, or maybe not obviously, I don't know, if you see actual abuse happening, say somebody hitting somebody, pushing somebody, is always okay to call 911 and report that. Um, Always, always, always. If you see it happening at that very moment where there's imminent danger to the person, always, always, always.
Great point.
So I will say that. I always try to mention that. But there's so many other things that you can do. Again, if we're talking about somebody who has a care provider is responsible for providing personal care, and you call APS and the worker comes out and they decide that there's not enough information to launch an investigation, now what? Right? Now what? That's why I always recommend, if you can, to talk to the actual survivor at the center to find out what they really want to do about it. Because sometimes they may need, I know this isn't right, but I need some time to get together another care plan, or I need to find an alternative, or I need to figure out this. Um, and then that's one of those things where you can say, hey, do you want any help with that? Can I help you with that? They may not, right? But let them tell you
Mhm.
if you can. Again, perfect scenario, obviously. Every scenario is different.
I think what you're saying is it depends on the sense of urgency, right? So, um,
Correct. Yeah.
I don't know, Krista, if we had a client recently who had some financial abuse. If you
Mm.
want to just give us, a snippet of how that came to our table and, how we walked through that.
Yeah, so a client of ours that lived alone that has caregivers, from our company, really good caregivers who started noticing different things happening, like her not getting her credit card bill in the mail anymore, or not understanding what was going on with her credit card.
Hmm.
or, interesting things coming in the mail, that didn't make sense for, certain accounts that she had. And so, we started questioning those things. And like I said, we had really good caregivers that had some experience in this way, that started questioning. And, the first thing was a phone call went to credit card company and found out that, the credit card was used. Accounts have been taken money, and several things occurred that, this particular person couldn't handle on her own. And, once we kind of found out what was occurring and that it was somebody close to her, we did call Adult Protective Services and get them involved. And by that point, because we had already talked to so many of the financial institutions, we had enough proof to show that something was occurring. But before we called APS, we talked with that particular client and, let them know what could occur. And while she was scared, I think that it led her to understand that what was happening to her was not okay. And so, sometimes, unfortunately, things get found in those kind of ways and you have to end up calling APS. But who knows what would have happened, how much more would have been taken from her, or what else happened to her. And obviously we know that more than one abuse occurs usually. So there's definitely some emotional abuse there. A lot of isolation. And it's terrible. And unfortunately, we're hearing of things, and there's got to be so much more going on in the world. But, without having those caregivers who paid attention to those things and knowing our client as well as we do, who knows what would have occurred.
That's the, oh my gosh, so that's the kind of thing that happens a lot of times, that we're just like, is this some late life crisis thing happening, like what's going on here, right? But if we just assume that that's that person's business, like, and there's nothing we can do about it, then we're not going to do anything about it, right? So, and fortunately, the caregivers were like, hey, this doesn't seem quite right, right? Not in a judgy way, but in like a, this seems out of character, what's going on kind of way, right?
Definitely. And definitely, I mean, at least, and this is not the same for everyone, but at least that client had very specific structured life choices, right? That, anything kind of swayed from one thing, you were like, nope, that's not right. I know that's not the case with everyone, but definitely with this particular client. And, so many things were lined up that we found out later on, and that we are still finding out so many more things were lined up, like the sale of a house. And, like there could have been so many other things, and you just would have never known. So luckily in that case, that particular client was very structured, and we couldn't do it that way.
So Krista, let me ask you, wasn't the one trigger here that she saw something on her charge card that she did not charge? It was as gentle as that. Okay.
She paid, so she's very able to watch her bills and watch those things, and she's very meticulous about that. And so, one charge, of course, led to a whole nother avenue. But yes, and specifically called me and said, this charge happened on this date for this, and this is what it was for, and it wasn't me.
Yes. And when we opened up Pandora's box, it was very deep. That's all we can say. So we go back to that initial conversation, Melissa, where you said, it could be very soft, something very simple. We could have turned our head to it. But when we opened up that door, it was very, very sad what occurred to her. But we're grateful that the team did take the action to call Adult Protective Services, which I think was there within 24 hours. Yeah, I think when you can standardize the situation that they're, it is very serious, they take quick action.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
one question, Melissa, I have for you that I know some families might have a confusion of, and we always say here is, if you think there's abuse, make the call. Don't question yourself. Don't think too deeply about it, because Adult Protective Services, in many cases, are very good at what they do. They're impartial. So they're going to show up at the door and kind of like, okay, what's happening? We don't quite trust the report yet. We need to be validated that there is something happening.
Yep.
We're not going to rip you from your home, so we try and assure people that, what this is going to look like. But in what instances do we call Adult Protective Services versus calling the police? Because they both are involved in these situations.
Yeah. No, I'm very glad to hear that that's kind of the philosophy, because I always say, whenever I talk to people, we want to act like Homeland Security. Like, if you see something, say something, right? Like, it's literally that simple. And yeah, so Adult Protective Services, their job is to investigate suspected claims of abuse. That's their job, is to investigate and determine whether or not it's happening. That's it. That's their job. It's not my job. As a mandated reporter, it's not a mandated reporter's job to investigate what's going on before you call APS, right? Um, it helps the more information you have, but just because you don't know for sure doesn't mean you don't have to call. Now, contrast that with calling the police is a much more urgent, emergent kind of situation, a crisis kind of situation that's happening at that time. This is the way I kind of think of them. So feel free to disagree. But the way I think about it is that, 911 is for those, oh my God, this is happening right this second. I need somebody here right this second to intervene, who has the training to intervene in these situations. That's when I would call 911. Um, there is no way, while somebody's threatening violence or hitting somebody and in front of you, that you're going to stop and be like, so tell me what's going on about that. That's not what's going to happen, right? Like, you need some strong, heavy-handed help at that moment, and that's where 911 calls comes in. Now, a history of those things, when it's not necessarily occurring right in front of you, that's absolutely, when you become aware of that, that's absolutely a viable APS call. Hey, we this person is telling us this happens multiple times. It's happened this many times in the past. We think it will happen again. That's why we're calling, right? Like, it can be that simple. They're very nice, the call center at APS. I can say that. I've had to call a couple of times. So I hope that helps, like, determine when one versus the other. If it's not necessarily something happening right at this very second, if you don't need a welfare check, if you don't need police intervention at the moment, I would route that through APS instead.
Got it. That's, I appreciate that, clarifying that. That's good. Okay. So, Krista, do you want to just switch over to the one form? And this, one of the forms that we've used, going to the Michigan Elder Abuse website, because there is a Michigan Elder Abuse website, is using this particular form. It actually, this is just the first half of the one page. It's a couple pages long. And there's also another form called the reader card for first responders. And it helps you really clarify in general terms what each category is, in the types of abuse, what falls under those abuses. If you want to have a little bit more information, this is where mandated reporters like us, we can either call the APS line or we can fill these out and send them in as well. Both situations work. So we keep these on our desks as well. So you can find these at that particular website that Krista put up. Do you want to show us that one more time, Krista? Yeah, so at this elder abuse website, you can find information. And Melissa, do you have anything else that would be important for us to know about elder abuse?
Oh,
So deep.
lots of things, but I think the most important thing is that you are not alone. And if you listen to your stomach, if your stomach is telling you something's going on or something's not right, it probably is. Ask a few more questions. For sure. Listen to yourself, listen to your gut, and
Yeah.
be Homeland Security. If you see something, say something.
Yes, Homeland Security for our seniors. That's what we want. With our superhero capes on, right?
Right. Dun, da, da, da.
Right. So thank you so much, Melissa. And I appreciate you opening up the door up for everybody to be able to call you if they're unsure, if they have questions over at the Disability Network of Eastern Michigan. We appreciate you. You're a wealth of knowledge. And thanks so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much for helping me spread the word.
Yes.
Thank you.